explosion event. 100 years in the making. The century. No man's land.
Good evening, I'm Peter Jennings, and welcome again to The Century. Over the course of the last 100 years, America has struggled to be the world's great defender of democracy. More than 80 years ago, President Woodrow Wilson advanced the notion that America, unlike any other nation, could champion the rights of mankind. In tonight's episode, No Man's Land, we call it, we'll see how deeply disappointed President Wilson was by America's experience in World War I. And by the time of the Vietnam War, how deeply disillusioned many Americans had become about America's role in the world. Tonight, two stories of promise and betrayal. And we begin on a train. In the first week of August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson was traveling by train from Rome, Georgia to Washington, D.C. He had just buried his wife of 30 years, Ellen. He was grieving, and he was alone. As he sat hour by hour staring out over the land where he had spent his youth, the thought of death weighed heavily. This was the old South of the Civil War. His earliest memories were of war, of Confederate soldiers wounded and dying in his father's church. The president was also forced to think of another war. He had just learned that the great nations of Europe had decided to go to war with each other. As he passed through fields where American soldiers had fought and fallen, the president wrestled with what role Americans might play now in a world at war.
When my grandfather became president, they hadn't really thought about world affairs and what part this great continental America could play.
Francis Sayre is President Wilson's grandson.
What was our mission in the world? What should we be doing with this new continent that the rest of the world sees as a vision and an ideal?
On that summer afternoon, the president considered his own journey. First as a college professor, then as a statesman, Woodrow Wilson had always believed that America's mission was to benefit humanity by example, as a peaceful democracy looking towards a world beyond war.
He knew war, so his first and foremost hope was that the United States would not be involved.
In 1914, the center of the world was Europe, and Europe was dominated by a small tribe of monarchs, bound by blood, entangled in a system of secret alliances, and determined to put as many men under arms as they could. No leader cared more about having an army than Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. He was assembling the largest standing army of them all, 5 million men.
Kaiser Wilhelm was physically, emotionally, and intellectually unbalanced. He was a grandson of Britain's Queen Victoria because all those ruling families were intermarried. He never got over the fact that his grandmother, Victoria, didn't love him as much, he felt, as she loved her other grandchildren.
The Kaiser's cousin, King George, sat on the British throne and ruled Europe's most powerful empire by far. Yet the king and another cousin, Russia's Tsar, so feared the Kaiser as a menace and a bully that they formed an alliance against him. In the summer of 1914, Europe was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. On June the 28th, 1914, in the streets of the Bosnian capital, Sarajevo, a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, assassinated the favorite nephew and heir of the Austrian emperor. The last words of Archduke Franz Ferdinand were, "Es ist nichts," it is nothing. But nothing could have been further from the truth. 1 month later, Austria declared war on Serbia with the support of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. That meant Austria and Germany going to war with Serbia's ally Russia, Russia's ally France, and Great Britain. which meant the Kaiser would be at war with his cousins, Tsar Nicholas and King George. By August 1914, nearly all of Europe was involved. On August the 12th, President Wilson returned to Washington from his wife's funeral with notes for a speech that he delivered to Congress a week later. He declared that America's response to this madness would be neutrality. As the rest of the world's powers took up arms, America would work for peace.
Wilson saw the United States as a city on the hill, a virtuous nation standing apart, whose role, as he soon came to believe, was to be primarily as a mediator.
President Wilson told the nation this was America's opportunity to gain great permanent glory. But King and Kaiser considered Wilson irrelevant. Their soldiers thought him a starry-eyed idealist. At that moment, most of Europe was convinced that the road to glory was the road to war. For the millions of young Europeans who joined up on both sides in 1914, war was seen as an exhilarating adventure. Donald Hodge thought it sounded like a bracing holiday from his job as a printer's apprentice in a suburb of London.
As soon as I enlisted, I was in a crowd of other 18, 19 and 20-year-olds, and we thought it was going to be a tremendous lark to go and knock the Kaiser off his throne, you see.
In Canada, 14-year-old Roy Henley liked the look of the uniform in the recruitment office window.
So I walked in. Recruiting sergeant said, "How old are you?" I said, 16. "You're too young." He says, "Go on, take a walk around the block. You might age." Come back, I got smart then. "Well, how old are you?" "Going on 18. "Fine, sign here." That's that.
And Ted Francis remembered how much he'd enjoyed being a Boy Scout. He joined up in Birmingham, England, in the very first weeks of the war.
Everyone thought the war would be over at Christmas, and they really badly wanted to get to France to get in the fighting. It's a long, long way to the forest, from my heart to my land.
Until they got to the front, it was like being a Boy Scout.
And then someone said to us excitedly, "Jack Smith." I said, "What about him?" "He's dead. He's been shot." The first one of the battalion to be shot. I said, "What?" "Yes, he's dead. He's been shot. He put his head too far over and a sniper got him." And that caused a bit of a sensation amongst the lads. They thought, well, this is not exactly what we come for kind of business. But later on, from that day onwards, when we went to the trenches, it was 3 killed, 4 killed, 5 killed, 20 killed, 100 killed. By then, we was veterans.
Imagine the kind of disillusion people suffered when they discovered that the war was going to be not just brutal and awful, but long. And there was no way out of it except to kill more people on the other side. And so all of Europe and England had built itself into a box that they couldn't escape.
It seems incredible that man could be guilty of such hatred of his fellow man, such savage lust for slaughter.
Generals and soldiers alike were shocked by the deadly capabilities of 20th century technology. Machine guns, an American invention perfected in Europe, artillery shells, and poison gas, which the Germans introduced, made the Western Front an unimaginable hell.
There were just the splintered trunks of trees, and there was the quagmire of the shell holes, and no grass. It was just like a lunar landscape, really.
At night, the rats, they grew to enormous sizes, feeding on the corpses there. It was impossible to get the dead buried.
We put dead bodies in the bottom of the trench so that we could stand on them to keep dry. And on some occasion, dead bodies was put on the top of the trench to make it higher, so that we could walk a bit better instead of crouching.
Only 5 months into the war, nearly 1 million men were already dead. Millions more were trapped in trenches stretching 500 miles from the English Channel across Belgium and France. The trenches were no better than graves for the living.
When I come back to you, love, someday.
Americans never dreamed that the war on the other side of the ocean might affect them. President Wilson had declared the United States officially neutral, and most of its citizens assumed the country would stay that way. Henry Villard came from a family that was active in the peace movement. They thought Wilson was a hero for keeping America out.
It was a different world. It was a quiet, peaceful world. People were going about their own business, the object being to make money. Everything was very pleasant indeed.
By early 1915, Americans going about their business had found that war was very good business. American bankers were lending money to Britain and France so that they could buy weapons and ammunition from Americans. The economy had never been so robust. In the spring of 1915, even the mood in the White House had brightened. The recently widowed president had fallen in love.
After my grandmother died, some months passed, and my grandfather's eye was caught by Edith.
Edith Galt, that is. The president had come home from playing golf with his doctor, Cary Grayson, when he encountered Edith Galt, who was visiting Wilson's cousin in the White House.
There was a moment where they were a little awkwardly meeting, but then were invited to sit down and have tea, and from that point on, the romance blossomed.
In the first week of May, the president shocked Mrs. Galt with a passionate proposal of marriage. At first, she turned him down, saying they'd only known each other for 2 months. Wilson persuaded her this was her fate. In New York City on May the 1st, 1915, 1,900 people boarded the luxury liner the Lusitania at Pier 54. The pride of the British Cunard Line was setting sail for England.
She was simply a wonderful, steady ship. She had 4 red funnels, and she was a beautiful sight to see. She really was.
Edith Stanley and her family were going home. The First World War was almost a year old, and any transatlantic crossing was made potentially dangerous by the presence of German submarines. But the passengers felt safe. No one would dare sink a passenger ship. Still, the German embassy had put a notice in the New York Times that very morning which said, "Travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk." The captain told a reporter that the warning was the best joke he'd heard in years. After 6 uneventful days at sea, on a beautiful sunny afternoon, May the 7th, the Lusitania was passing safely by the Irish coast.
It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You could see all this coastline, and then bang! Dad knew what it was. I mean, that he knew darn well it was a torpedo.
The German torpedo did such damage to the Lusitania that she sank in 18 minutes. Only 6 of her lifeboats were launched.
But we could not take the people in that were begging to be taken in. I mean, we'd have capsized and everybody would have gone. 1,200 drowned, didn't they? There was 1,200 drowned. More drowned than were saved.
Including 128 Americans.
The Lusitania, that's only 3 years after the Titanic. One writer said, now it's the act of man, not the act of God, that has done this.
The British and the French hoped that this outrage would bring the Americans into the war on their side. But that night, President Wilson refused even to hear the details of the sinking, fearing that he would react too strongly and lose control. President Wilson agonized at his typewriter for 3 days. On the third day, he finally typed out not a declaration of war, but a strongly worded note of protest to the Kaiser.
The Kaiser reacted with, as he always did, with a blend of defiance and concern. He would sort of wave his good fist in the air and saying, "No man tells me what to do. This little Wilson is only a college professor. Who cares about him?" And the next he would say, "There are a lot of those Americans over there, and they have a lot of industrial capacity. We'd better be careful."
When the Germans sank another British liner with the loss of 2 more American lives, the president protested again. This time he threatened to break diplomatic relations with Germany. On September the 1st, Wilson got what he wanted, a pledge from the Germans that they would call off their submarines. The British and the French were angry that Wilson refused to enter the war. On the Western Front, the British troops had come up with a joke. They called the shells that wouldn't explode, the duds, Wilsons. By the new year in 1916, over a year into the war, there was no movement whatsoever along the Western Front. The generals of both armies had resorted to a most primitive form of warfare, throwing men at each other in a desperate attempt to punch through enemy lines. All this did was result in unparalleled carnage. In late June, the British commander, General Douglas Haig, was ready to launch an attack the British were sure would break the deadlock. 200 British battalions were deployed on a front 25 miles wide along the River Somme in France.
For 6 months, people had been preparing for it. Special railway tracks had been laid to help bring the ammunition and materials and the artillery up.
There had never been an artillery barrage like this. For 5 continuous days and nights, the British shelled the German trenches.
They were hoping to burst through with that attack and allow the cavalry, which were behind them, to rush through all the way to Berlin and to end the war victoriously.
Ted Francis remembered it vividly.
There must be 1,000 guns if there was one. It was a terrible roar from morning till night. But the officers said, "Tomorrow, boys, you'll be over the top, and don't worry," he says. "There'll be no trenches there. Our shells have blown to pieces. There'll be no Germans there. They're blown to pieces. All you have to do is to walk over and take those trenches. In fact," he says, "you can carry your rifle like a bag."
At 7:30 a.m. on July the 1st, 1916, General Haig ordered the shelling stopped. In the sudden silence, 11 British divisions, more than 100,000 men, stepped into no man's land.
They didn't get 200 feet from the trench.
The German trenches were deeper and better fortified than the Allies knew.
The Germans, after the shelling, they simply come out of the dugouts, grabbed their machine guns, and then waited for the Tommies. They just simply swabbed them down. So you're cutting down grain. One German machine gunner said, I stopped firing because I was sickened by what we were doing.
On that single summer day, 22,000 British soldiers were killed. 40,000 were wounded. It was one of the bloodiest days in the history of war.
It was a butcher shop magnified by 1,000,000 times.
But General Haig reported to London, "It all went like clockwork. Our troops are in wonderful spirits and full of confidence. The way to capture machine guns," he said, "is by grit and determination." The British commanders ordered more troops over the top, and they were gunned down. Ted Francis and his battalion waited for their signal to go.
Officers are down below us in the trenches with a whistle, and when they blow that whistle, we got to dash out of the trenches and make for this German trench. And it is in those few 4 or 5 minutes that we look at each other and say, "Oh, well, now I shall do this." Some were visibly shaking, some were crying, some were almost shell-shocked before they start.
And yet, the British sense of honor was such that they had very few deserters. Nobody ever quit, sensibly. They just couldn't arrive at that violation of British ethical norms.
And when before the German hail of lead and explosive, even these stout-hearted hesitated, Piper Laidlaw mounted the parapet and won his Victoria Cross, piping his comrades forward.
And so they rushed forward, and they were shot down repeatedly and repeatedly. At that moment, all of Europe's views about warfare had to be changed. The idea of heroism was dead from that moment, because it didn't help you to survive whether you were heroic or not.
The Battle of the Somme lasted 5 months. There were 1 million casualties, and the front line never moved more than 3 miles in either direction. To break the terrible deadlock, the Germans looked to the sea. On January the 31st, 1917, President Wilson got word that 100 German submarines had taken up positions in the Atlantic with orders to fire at will on all Allied and neutral ships, including unarmed American ships.
I think that shook people into a realization that we were in it, that we were, like, whether we liked it or not, that we were involved.
Wilson had just been re-elected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But the pressure in the country to fight the Germans was building. On February 3rd, the president broke diplomatic relations with Germany, but he did not declare war. 3 American ships were torpedoed and sunk in a week. Still, the president hesitated. An intercepted telegram revealed a German plot encouraging Mexico to invade the United States. Still, Wilson did not declare war. Then he heard the news from London.
The British finally explained the truth of their situation. They were broke. They didn't have any money left. They didn't have any men left. But for the first time, Wilson had to face up to the possibility of a British-French defeat.
What a step to take, to be president of a country about to go to war in the world. He needed God's help for that, and he felt it.
At 8 p.m. on April the 2nd, 1917, the president stood before the House and the Senate and asked for a declaration of war. "We have no selfish ends to serve," he told the members. "We desire no conquest, no dominion. We are but one of the champions of mankind. But the world," he said, "must be made safe for democracy." That night, for only the second time, the Capitol was lit with electric light.
He received the biggest ovation of his life. The country was ready to go to war. Wilson himself, strangely, was not. There was an element to Wilson's character that was bound to see war as a tremendous human tragedy and folly. And when Wilson went back to the White House and put his head on the cabinet table and sobbed uncontrollably.
On April the 6th, 1917, the United States ended its isolation from Europe with a declaration of war on Germany. Woodrow Wilson's America believed it was going to war to end all war.
Wilson formulated a doctrine that, in a sense, has haunted us ever since. If we had to get involved in the wars and politics of Europe, it would have to be with the object of changing them. So, of changing the whole European-ruled world.
Cornel Davis clipped Wilson's speech from the newspaper in his Mississippi high school library and memorized it.
He said, "Right is more precious than peace, and we're going to fight for the things which we have carried nearest our heart. We're going to fight for a universal dominion of right. By such a concert of free people, it's going to bring peace and happiness to the whole world."
For this kind of war, even Henry Villard could convince his family of pacifists to let him go.
The idea of a last great war and being part of it was very, very strong. I said, if we're never going to see another war, this is the time to see it.
But this crusade would require more than a handful of idealists. In April 1917, the U.S. Army had only about 200,000 soldiers. 3 million men would be needed. The president would have to mobilize an entire nation.
He changed. He said, we've got to fight this war and we've got to win it.
Woodrow Wilson, once the world's most eloquent voice for peace, had become the nation's most persuasive advocate for war. As Americans mobilized for war, many Europeans had had enough. Exhausted by 3 years of senseless fighting, more than 30,000 French soldiers had mutinied. British hospitals were treating something they'd never seen before, shell shock, a mutiny of the mind and the body against the horror of war. In Russia, where millions of soldiers had deserted and starving peasants hungered for peace, revolution was brewing. And then into this chaos came a Russian exile. On April the 16th, Vladimir Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd.
He was met by a large number of people, and he stood on an armored personnel carrier and gave a speech about how Russia needed to leave the war.
He spoke with a lot of gestures.
Sasha Bryansky was there.
Thrust forward, calling us to advance, saying power had been taken over by the bourgeoisie that went on with the bloody war. A new order had to be established to ensure the power of the working class.
Early in the morning of November the 7th, 1917, the Russian Revolution began with a nearly bloodless coup. On November the 8th, Lenin announced the world's first communist nation, and that Russia would no longer fight the Germans.
We declare peace. Russia leaves the war. We tell the army to come home. We tell Germany and the Western powers, stop this war, end this war. Join us in declaring peace.
For the Germans, this was not just a stroke of luck.
Lenin had been sent by the Germans into Russia for the very purpose of overthrowing the pro-Allied regime and taking Russia out of the war.
Lenin's announcement was doubly devastating to the British and the French, who were still waiting for American troops to reinforce the Western Front.
They're scared. They're just plain scared of the effect this Bolshevik propaganda is having on their own supporters. That's Wilson's great opening.
President Wilson and Vladimir Lenin had one thing in common. Each man wanted to change the world. In January 1918, President Wilson stepped onto the world stage with his alternative to the old balance of power. To a Europe devastated by war, the president proposed his 14-point program for world peace. He championed the rights of all people to governments of their own choosing, and a peaceful world preserved by a league of nations so that nothing like this would ever happen again. Peace, said Wilson, is what Americans were fighting for. By May of 1918, hundreds of thousands of American troops were pouring into France every month, ready to fight and infused with the spirit of their crusade.
Keep your head down, Fritzy boy. Keep your head down, Fritzy boy.
The Americans were seen as victory's men, fresh and young and confident. Albert Powys, a Marine of the Fighting Fifth, was ready for action.
We were used for morale boosters. We'd go to the camps where they was resting up the English and the French and that there, and we'd march past them there, you know, with our heads up and one thing and another. We was cocky as the devil. And that was to bring up their morale. Our morale was really high.
We was coming to the end of our men, and when the Americans decided to have a go, I could have said hooray.
Cocky as they were, the first American units to arrive on the battlefield were just as horrified by the reality of war as the Europeans had been 4 years earlier. Henry Villard had left Harvard to drive an ambulance in Italy. On his first day, he learned how far from home he was.
The first person that I put into the ambulance was a man who had a grenade exploding in his hands, and it had blown off both his legs. So he was moaning and groaning the entire time from the front lines to the hospital, calling out for me to drive slowly, slowly, slowly. And by the time I reached the hospital, he was dead. Well, this was a kind of a cold water treatment all of a sudden to realize what war was like. It was no longer freshman studies. It was the real world.
50,000 Americans died in battle on the Western Front in the summer and fall of 1918. But there were so many Americans pouring off ships month after month. And the news that there were 3 million more on their way convinced the German generals there was no hope.
The roof was falling in. More and more Americans were coming. Germany was starving. And finally, there was practically a mutiny. The Kaiser gave up.
The German generals drove the Kaiser into exile in Holland. They installed a new government and appealed to President Wilson for peace on his terms. Finally, at 11 o'clock on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the shooting stopped.
That sudden hush, after 4 years of continual gunfire, had become part of our life. There seemed to be something missing. We didn't believe it, you know.
Nearly 10 million people had died in 4 years of war. The World War had destroyed a world, and no one knew what would come in its place. In December 1918, 1 month after the armistice ending the Great War was signed, the USS George Washington arrived off the coast of France. On it, the President and his wife, Edith, bound for the peace conference in Paris. Never before in the history of the world had millions of people come out for one man, such as the people of Europe did for President Wilson. They had come out to cheer for the American president, for the principles he stood for, and the peace that he promised.
He was greeted as a savior. His great hopes, his enormous confidence for a peaceful future for the world were actually the hopes of Europeans, men and women and children who had just been through the ghastly experience of World War I.
Armed with American optimism and his 14 points, President Wilson intended to dismantle the old balance of power and to create a world without conquest or colonies, where all peoples would have a right to self-determination and a league of democratic nations to keep the peace.
He had enormous currency when the conference began for what he stood for. Things changed when he had to sit down with the other heads of government and heads of state with whom he had to work out the details of the League and of the peace.
We were going to change their politics. We were going to change their politics in such a way that there wouldn't be wars anymore. We would change their politics in a way that would make them like us. And that's what he was there in Paris to do. And how on earth was he going to do it? He never, ever seems to have thought out this question of what are the means and methods and so on that would enable him to achieve those objectives. And all he knew how to do was make beautiful speeches. And that's not enough.
The European powers had a long laundry list of grievances. They had paid in blood, in the blood of millions of men, for whatever they could get, and they were determined to get something. And Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Britain, and Clemenceau of France, and Orlando of Italy, were not going to turn the other cheek after they'd gone through this bloody 4-year war. They wanted revenge.
Wilson was furious. He did not think the Germans should be humiliated. He asked the French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, if he'd ever been to Germany. No, Clemenceau answered, but the Germans have been to France twice in my lifetime. Wilson, the moralizing college professor, was no match for the battle-scarred European leaders. In the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, Wilson realized their true intentions had nothing to do with peace. By the rules of their game, to the victors would go the spoils. Great Britain and France made short work of Wilson's 14 points and carved up the fallen German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires in ways that would haunt the rest of the century. The victors divided the Middle East among them and partitioned Eastern Europe to create new nations with old grudges. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June the 28th, 1919, 5 years to the day after Archduke Franz Ferdinand had been assassinated in Sarajevo. Their terms for Germany were so punishing that another great war seemed inevitable.
And because Versailles didn't settle the issues, after an intermission of 20 years, that war began again in 1939. It's a mere continuation of the, I shouldn't say mere, a continuation of the First World War. And that war, in turn, could not be brought to an end in 1945 because the Allies quarreled. And that quarrel over peace terms is what we call the Cold War. The result is that the war that broke out in August 1914 did not come to an end until August 31st, 1994, when the last Russian troops left German soil.
Woodrow Wilson had salvaged only 1 point from the wreckage of his 14, the League of Nations. To him, it was the last great hope for world peace. But America, sick of war, disgusted with Europe, turned its back on Wilson and on the world. The Treaty of Versailles was never ratified by the Senate. The United States never joined the League of Nations. President Wilson suffered a devastating stroke as he tried to convince the country otherwise. His vision of the world would survive him, an increasingly democratic world led by the United States. "I would rather fail in a cause that someday will triumph," he said, "than to win in a cause that I know someday will fail." One of the exciting things about reporting the century is coming upon connections. At that peace conference in Paris 80 years ago, a 25-year-old kitchen worker showed up hoping to meet President Wilson. His name was Ho Chi Minh, and he wanted to give the president a petition that his country, Vietnam, be supported in its struggle to be free. Vietnam was then a French colony. Isn't it ironic that several decades later, Ho Chi Minh, who so admired Wilson, was leading the fight to expel America from Vietnam? Now, there may be Americans watching tonight who were born after America was defeated in Vietnam. And so very briefly, by the 1970s, it was North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union and China, against South Vietnam, supported by the U.S. Our second hour begins in 1975. After 500,000 American ground troops have gone home, there are only 6,000 Americans left in Vietnam, almost all of them civilians. The North and the South have agreed on a ceasefire. War rarely ends that cleanly. For 20 years, the bloody struggle between North and South Vietnam wore on, drawing in the Cold War powers, locked in bitter stalemate. And then on December the 13th, 1974, everything changed. The North Vietnamese launched a full-scale assault on the South Vietnamese province of Phuc Long, only 75 miles from Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital. Only North Vietnamese cameras filmed the assault. Most Western journalists had left when America's fighting troops went home. As their defenses crumbled, South Vietnam's leaders turned to their American ally for support. They sent their ambassador, Bui Diem, to Washington.
By the time I arrived to Washington, there was practically no people to talk to. Dr. Kissinger was in the Middle East. President Ford was in Vail, Colorado for skiing.
President Ford and most Americans wanted to forget a war that had cost so many lives and achieved so little. But it was a war that had not yet ended.
In Washington, they all talked about this war in the past tense, as if it were over, as if this peace agreement had been successful.
Arnold Isaacs was in Saigon reporting for the Baltimore Sun. He realized that the battle for Phuc Long marked a whole new phase in the war.
This was the first time in the whole war that the communists had taken an objective and they could hold it. They weren't going to get kicked out.
This is the most serious military situation in South Vietnam since the new American commander-in-chief took office.
White House officials say it is obvious the South Vietnamese are going to have to hack it on their own.
By January the 8th, 1975, the entire province of Phuc Long had fallen to the North Vietnamese. For many South Vietnamese, like former Second Lieutenant Nguyen Ngoc Nan, the truth had not yet sunk in.
We still believe that at the last minute, we will be rescued by the American power. We kept waiting until nothing happened.
America's inaction sent a clear signal to the North Vietnamese. They had a green light to undo the South. While many people in the United States seemed indifferent, in Washington, a small group with close ties to Vietnam watched in alarm.
We had the advantage of looking, in my position in particular, at all of the intelligence that was coming in about what the North Vietnamese were doing.
Lionel Rosenblatt, then at the State Department in Washington, had spent years in South Vietnam as a civilian advisor. So had his State Department colleague, Craig Johnstone.
We tried to assess how many Vietnamese had associated themselves with us to the extent that they would be at risk if North Vietnam took over the South. And that number ran up as high as 1 million people.
We saw that the North Vietnamese were gathering steam in a tremendously rapid and effective fashion. That to us was a very, very alarming development.
I think both Lionel and I had come to the conclusion that it was going to be a very unpleasant future for those who stayed on in Vietnam.
Yet Graham Martin was there, our ambassador in Saigon, reporting that things were looking quite rosy, not to worry, et cetera, et cetera.
Ambassador Graham Martin, an old-school Cold Warrior, was determined to put a good face on the situation. He continually downplayed the troubles facing the regime of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. Thieu's limited popularity with the South Vietnamese people hinged on his ability to deliver U.S. military and economic assistance. By 1975, Thieu's luck had run out. 2 years of drastic cuts in American military aid had left the South Vietnamese army demoralized.
The situation was very, very serious because it affected the morale of the fighting troops. The South Vietnamese received just a few $100 million in terms of economic aid. It was not enough to feed the military people, the military machine of South Vietnam.
On March the 10th, 1975, the North Vietnamese launched a surprise attack on Bon Mae Tuot in the Central Highlands, and by doing so threatened to cut South Vietnam in half. President Thieu was stunned. He decided too late to consolidate his forces, ordering all troops in the central region to withdraw immediately. And so the South Vietnamese retreat began from Pleiku. It was in Pleiku in 1965 that an attack had triggered the buildup of U.S. troops in Vietnam. The retreating soldiers had their families stationed with them, and the escape route quickly became jammed as thousands of women and children rushed to get out.
We picked up intelligence indicating that the South Vietnamese army was strung out among civilians in one of the roads leading from the highlands to the coast.
Frank Snepp was a CIA analyst at the embassy in Saigon.
As the civilians and the army became intermingled and began to back up at a stream crossing very close to the coast, the North Vietnamese just swept out of the highlands and crushed them. They destroyed most of the retreating forces from the highlands.
Looking back, I don't think anybody could prevent that disaster, because that was the first time the Vietnamese troop received an order from the president or from the general who gave order to withdraw. Withdraw means surrender, means giving up. And that gave the panic to the whole people.
The panic mounted when President Thieu abruptly pulled his best troops out of yet another region farther north. He wanted to create a protected enclave around Saigon. The troops left behind in the north knew they had been abandoned, and many of them broke ranks and fled even before the North Vietnamese attacked. They left their last stockpiles of weapons and ammunition behind. In the final days of March, the coastal cities of South Vietnam fell like dominoes. Hundreds of thousands of refugees began pouring into the port city of Da Nang.
I saw a steamrolling effect, almost like an avalanche. There would be no way that you would sustain the morale necessary to keep the rest of the region and then to maintain this so-called enclave that they were talking about.
Teresa Tull was second in command at the consulate in Da Nang. They began evacuating their Vietnamese co-workers immediately.
We were influenced very heavily by the behavior of the communists in Hue during the Tet Offensive in 1968 when they killed just about everybody affiliated that they could find with the Vietnamese government.
Robert Greeley, a political officer at the consulate, remembers how desperate the South Vietnamese were when an airlift from Da Nang was organized.
The mobs were getting a hold of vehicles and they were chasing the airplanes up and down the runway. The plane would never stop. It would only slow down and we'd try to get people onto the airplane. It became wild and dangerous.
The South Vietnamese rushed to the beaches, where the first American troops had arrived exactly a decade earlier. Now tens of thousands of refugees were swarming onto barges and merchant marine boats, summoned by urgent calls of SOS.
As the civilians were coming up the gangway onto the ship, or climbing up the ladders onto the ship, they were being robbed and beaten by armed troops.
South Vietnamese soldiers, also desperate to escape, were fighting for space.
They were killing people who resisted them. It was insane. I don't know how many people drowned in the Han River that night, but there were a lot of them.
I believed very deeply in what the United States was trying to do in Vietnam, and I believe that when the United States gives its word, we should stick with it. And to be in a position where you have given commitments, and in effect, as a nation, we tired of it, and you're on the scene and you have to tell these people that you have gotten to know and care for and work with daily that, well, I'm very sorry, but you know how it is politically in the United States. Good luck. I'm going home. And I'm going home to my nice free country where I'll be comfortable. And you stay here and face the future. It was devastating to me personally.
Da Nang fell to the North Vietnamese on March the 30th. The entire northern region, 2/3 of South Vietnam, was now in their hands.
The map was changing with dizzying speed. And after years of not changing at all, I can't begin to convey, I don't think, how unreal this seemed, that all of a sudden this war was taking this completely new and unexpected shape in front of our eyes. I mean, I was there and I couldn't believe it.
Ambassador Martin was not there to witness the collapse of the northern areas. He had gone back to the U.S. for dental surgery. Frank Snepp briefed him when he got back to Saigon.
So, Mr. Ambassador, half of the South Vietnamese army has been destroyed. He looked at me incredulously and he said, I don't believe it, Frank.
With the loss of Da Nang, Hue, and with the North Vietnamese juggernaut coming down Highway 1 towards Saigon, all of us felt under terrible pressure.
Stuart Harrington, an Army intelligence officer, had worked alongside the South Vietnamese for several years.
Many of us had Vietnamese friends. We had friends in the States who had Vietnamese wives, Vietnamese relatives in Vietnam who needed to get out. And we looked to the embassy, and of course Ambassador Martin was still maintaining that there was no real emergency, there was no need to panic, no need for an evacuation.
I think the government can handle it in the future, can become self-sufficient, can keep their freedom, and allow us, when we end our involvement here, to withdraw, as I think we should, leaving South Vietnam economically viable, militarily capable of defending itself with its own manpower, and free to choose its own government, its own leaders, as its people themselves may freely determine. This is a goal which is easily within our reach.
Ambassador Martin knew that while he was giving that interview, North Vietnamese troops were fighting only 40 miles east of Saigon.
It seemed almost like it was a sense of denial. We had, even right up to the end, the embassy was reporting back in ways that led one to believe that they didn't think that the imminent collapse of Saigon or Vietnam was likely.
We kept developing the notion that we ought to at least salvage a little bit of honor by, if we were running away in Vietnam, affording the people who worked closely with us a chance to come.
Ambassador Martin went in, I think it was on the 18th of April, to discuss the possibility of an evacuation with President Thieu. His cable traffic coming out after that meeting essentially led us to believe that he had no plans at all for the evacuation of the Vietnamese who had worked with us loyally in Vietnam.
Martin did allow contingency planning for the evacuation of American personnel to begin, but his priority was to not create a general panic by moving too quickly.
We had a very delicate operation to conduct there, because if you showed too much eagerness, then the whole thing could collapse.
The Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was following the situation very closely.
So I was not as negative on Martin as most of the bureaucracy was. And he was sort of on board to get people out. But he was dragging his feet, there's no doubt about it.
By April the 20th, North Vietnamese divisions were moving on Saigon from 3 directions.
The fact that the Vietnamese were going to be left in the lurch was extremely troubling to us, beyond troubling. It was unacceptable.
I went in, I recalled to Craig's office and said that I'm going back, and I think I can at least find a few of the people that I used to work with. And are you interested in going? And he said, just without hesitation, yes, if you think we can make a difference.
Johnstone and Rosenblatt told no one of their plans. Risking their State Department careers, they headed for Vietnam. They got on the last American commercial flight to land in Saigon. On April the 22nd, 1975, when Craig Johnstone and Lionel Rosenblatt landed in Saigon, they were determined to help the South Vietnamese, whose lives were in danger, leave the country while they could. With the North Vietnamese army poised to attack, they found the mood in Saigon was not what they expected.
The impression that one got there was sort of surreal. There was tension in the streets, but even there, people didn't know for sure what was going to happen, and some people dismissing the fact that there was even a realistic threat. A very bizarre situation.
The capital had been cordoned off to keep out the refugees fleeing from the north. The South Vietnamese government and the U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin were determined to keep the chaos from spilling into Saigon.
You wouldn't know that anything difficult was about to face this city. So in that sense, Graham Martin had done his job superbly, and the Vietnamese were just in blissful ignorance. And so we were much more apprehensive than the people we were running into.
For many South Vietnamese, it was hard to believe that the United States, after spending $150 billion and losing 58,000 American lives, was just going to look the other way. Ambassador Bui Diem, just returning from Washington, was one of the few South Vietnamese in a position to understand.
At this time, there are still a lot of hopes in Saigon about the American. But my message to all of them was crystal clear. For the American, the war ended already.
The issue is with everybody was, why are we rushing so fast? I'd like some time to get organized, get hold of my assets, say goodbye to my parents, et cetera, et cetera. And we would look at our watches and say, you don't have that much time.
And essentially, if you knew someone and you were at risk, you probably had a chance of getting out. If you didn't, if you were not privy to what was taking place, and it happened very quickly, then you got left behind.
When Rosenblatt and Johnstone stopped by the embassy, they heard that the State Department was furious at their unauthorized mission and had actually issued warrants for their arrest.
So we spent about 10 seconds in the embassy and sped off, but that was very useful because we got the names and numbers then of people at the airport who were forming the beginning of this evacuation network.
Out at Ton Son Nhut Airport, the military did get the ambassador's approval to begin a low-profile evacuation, in contrast to the inaction at the embassy itself. Non-essential personnel, dependents, and select Vietnamese were being airlifted out under the command of General Homer Smith.
I passed the word out that we would evacuate all of our people, Vietnamese or Americans, who wanted to go, and their families. We would bring people into our compound and house them overnight, and then build them into movable packets and ship them out.
We spent those last couple of weeks working almost full time, day and night, pumping people out as fast as we could by every rouge and subterfuge that you can imagine. So in my case, I borrowed a freezer truck from a friend who was running his own black operations. It had an embassy license plate on it, and I used that truck to take out a number of my intelligence officer friends and their families, just stuffed them in the truck, locked them in there, and sneaked them onto the air base, and stuck them on an airplane and got them out.
At that time, I could not find anybody to help me to flee the country.
Nan, the former soldier, was rushing around Saigon on a scooter with his wife and one-year-old son on the back.
And everybody asked each other, do you have any way to leave the country? Do you have any connection with the American or even the Filipinos or who worked in there before, and they can bring you out? Can you help me? Something like that. A lot of worry questions.
We didn't begin to touch the total number of people at risk. So some got out, some didn't get out. It was very, very ad hoc.
Between them, John Stone and Rosenblatt think they got around 500 people out before they too departed. That week, South Vietnam's President Thieu resigned in a tearful speech blaming the United States for abandoning South Vietnam. Thieu's vice president, Tran Van Huong, was inaugurated, only to be replaced within days by yet another politician, Nguyen Van Minh.
There was this strange political intrigue, meaning nothing. This sort of play that they were putting on, no connection at all to the reality of what was happening to them.
In a cable to the White House, Ambassador Martin continued to express confidence in the government of South Vietnam, while President Ford made his position very clear in a speech at Tulane University.
Today, America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned.
On the morning of April the 29th, 1975, the North Vietnamese final offensive began with a rocket attack on Saigon's Ton Son Nhut Air Base.
About 3 o'clock, morning of the 29th, my wife and I were blown out of bed.
2 American Marines were killed, the last Americans to die in Vietnam.
Columns of smoke towering up from the air base and the sound of the explosions. You know, the population was extremely agitated.
The streets were jammed with panic-stricken Vietnamese already. It was about 5:30 in the morning. Everyone was heading for the embassy walls.
The embassy plan was for the embassy employees to be taken in, I believe, 6 pre-positioned buses that were in the embassy grounds out to the air base to fly out.
The plan had to change. The North Vietnamese rockets had damaged the runways. The backup plan called for helicopters.
And I said, Mr. Ambassador, we've got 140,000 North Vietnamese forces within 20 minutes of downtown Saigon, and he wouldn't believe it. Nor would he believe that the airstrikes had destroyed the runways at Ton Son Nhut, as our American military attaché out there said they had. He insisted on going out and seeing for himself.
I had one of the officers brief him on the situation. He said, well, he's going to go back to his office and think about it.
As Ambassador Martin continued to think about calling in the helicopters, the crowds outside the embassy began to get larger. The CIA's own helicopters were already coming and going, taking their own endangered contacts out to the 7th Fleet, sitting off the coast in the South China Sea.
It was mid-morning. Air America choppers were moving from the roof of the embassy to various buildings around Saigon to pick up Vietnamese who couldn't get over the walls. There was an old chopper pilot, O.B. Harnage. He spearheaded that helicopter airlift that morning, the improvisatory one. That famous picture of the Vietnamese climbing up a ladder to a roof and a chopper on the roof and a man leaning down to help them up, that was Harnage. That rooftop was the deputy CIA station chief's house, and some of the most imperiled Vietnamese were those climbing that ladder. Harnage got him out.
By now, 1,000 people had gathered at the embassy, hoping to be evacuated. The ambassador had anticipated only 200. There was a flurry of phone calls between the White House, General Smith, and the embassy, pressuring the ambassador for a decision on the airlift.
I called the ambassador and I said, Mr. Ambassador, there's no way we're going to get out of here on fixed-wing aircraft. He said, are you sure of that? I said, yes, sir. He said, okay. So he called. That was about 10:30 in the morning. Called for the rotary wing evacuation.
Finally, Ambassador Martin had agreed. and the White House and the Pentagon began the massive helicopter operation codenamed Frequent Wind.
We knew the Vietnamese were going to be in Saigon the next morning. So we had to get out whatever we could that day. We had an ambassador who didn't want to leave, so we couldn't fully rely on his judgment of the situation. So, and the Pentagon, quite frankly, had made me the fall guys and made me, I had to authorize every helicopter so that if one got shot down, there was a designated victim.
Although the command was given at 11 a.m., no helicopters appeared for hours.
And then happened one of these classic screw-ups. The Pentagon had not agreed on what time to use. Greenwich Mean Time, Asian time, Washington time. And we actually had to get every helicopter back, sit them down again, and say start. So we wasted a couple of hours that way.
The embassy was now an island amidst a sea of humanity. And to get through the gates, you had to find an American on the other side who knew you, and some pushed and shoved to get through those gates.
I saw some people crying, some people sneaking, and some people tried to push some other people. It was a very messy scene.
Inside the embassy, they were frantically shredding documents. Then Ambassador Martin announced that he wanted to burn some files left at his residence, which was several blocks away.
I said, "Oh, Mr. Ambassador, don't do that. We got 4,000 people outside now clamoring at the gates."
Marine Major Jim Keane was in charge of embassy security.
Ready to crack the gate!
We attempted to get the gate open. And I came back and said, "That's not going to happen." He got out, he was madder than hell, he slammed the door, and he decided to walk. So we had to throw together a detail of Marines to block the crowds and try to, everybody was armed to the teeth, and he walked down to the residence. They used thermite grenades to destroy the files. Martin, almost in a fit of pique, told one of the Marines to set off a thermite grenade on his grand piano. He didn't want anybody using it.
He was just in a state of total collapse. Almost a pathetic figure, as a matter of fact. I had great sympathy for him.
Colonel Harry Summers had come from the air base to assist with the embassy evacuation.
Ambassador Martin's world was coming to an end. I mean, everything that he'd been sent over there to do, everything that he believed in, was turning sour.
Major Keane finally waved in the first helicopters at 3 p.m. Saigon time. The recreation compound next door to the embassy became a holding area for the 2,000 or so now inside the embassy's walls. Small groups were taken into the interior courtyard. A landing zone had been cleared. A tree was cut down so the huge transport helicopters could land safely.
90 on a CH-53, 50 on a CH-46, feeding refugees up through the stairwell in the embassy to the rooftop, marshaling them by the firehouse to get into the helicopters in the parking lot, and really pumping out a lot of people.
In the largest helicopter evacuation on record, Marine helicopters flew over 600 missions that day and night, taking more than 1,000 Americans and nearly 6,000 Vietnamese to the aircraft carriers waiting offshore.
Every time we saw a helicopter taking off, we felt even worse. We felt that we are left behind. How come those people are luckier than us? I stood there with my wife without no hope. I know that. I knew that I could not get into there. So finally I went home and just waited for the destiny, for the fate to come.
As 16 North Vietnamese divisions encircled Saigon, skirmishes broke out on the city limits.
This scene at Newport Bridge on the outskirts of Saigon is the proof, if any proof is needed, that the communist forces are finally closing in on the capital. This is the closest the fighting has ever come to Saigon since the Communist offensive in 1968. Lori Bliss, ABC News, Saigon.
On the afternoon of the 29th, with the fall of Saigon imminent, the crowds of South Vietnamese outside the gates of the embassy were growing desperate.
There was a terrible emotional drama going on at those gates, and those young Marines were in a very stressful situation. Because those who were clamoring to get in were holding letters, crying out that they worked for Mr. Hunter. I work, Secretary Mr. Hunter, please, please let me in. I can't live with the communists. And it was a heart-rending set of circumstances.
Inside the compound, Harrington and others who spoke Vietnamese tried to maintain calm among the 2,000 lucky enough to be there.
I persistently reassured the crowds in Vietnamese that everyone would go, that no one would be left behind. Không ai sẽ bị bỏ lại was the phrase. Nobody will be left behind. As long as we're here, you're safe, and nobody's going to leave us behind, and we are not leaving until the last helicopter. So please, relax, get in line, stay in family groups, and you've got to get rid of your luggage. The helicopters can only take people, not suitcases.
Out at the airport, the airlift had gone quite smoothly. The military took out more than 4,000 people. But here at the embassy, a communications problem was developing.
Periodically, they'd ask from the fleet, how many people are left in the embassy, and throughout that late the 29th and right up through around midnight, there's a terrible problem which becomes a credibility gap where the embassy appears to Washington to be a bottomless pit. The belief in Washington was that Ambassador Martin had lost his objectivity and was trying to evacuate all of Saigon through the conduit of the U.S. Embassy, and the embassy evacuation would go on until halted because Martin was just going to stubbornly stay there and keep putting people out.
Dr. Kissinger and Defense Secretary James Schlesinger discussed ending the airlift.
I said, how many people are there? He said 700. I said, how many does it take to get them out? He said 13 helicopters. So I said, okay, let's use 19 as a safety factor. And the ambassador has to be on the 19th helicopter.
But when Washington was given the number 700, there may have actually been twice that many people waiting. Kissinger really needed yet another 6 helicopters to get everyone out.
Whereas on the ground, we are whittling away at the number so that by 3 in the morning, we're down to 420 refugees. 6 or 8 more helicopters, and it would be a clean sweep.
They didn't know we were down to 6 loads. Nobody knew that except us.
Colonel Summers, along with Harrington and their commanding officer, Colonel John Madison, had no idea that the White House had ordered the airlift to end.
But it was never communicated to us. We were caught somewhat by surprise when I think it was the ambassador's assistant came down, in fact, and lied to us and said that the lift was continuing, stay there on the LZ, that the helicopters were coming in, and he went up and left. The only time in 38 years of military service I had ever been lied to in an operational matter.
We just kept loading helicopters till all of a sudden there wasn't any more helicopters. Then, what's going on? At the same time, the helicopter control sent out this tagger, which is the signal to say that the next bird in the zone takes the ambassador out. And that order had come from Washington, D.C.
The ambassador's helicopter had arrived from the aircraft carrier Okinawa.
With that, I dropped and I ran down into the ambassador's office. Martin was still sorting files. I said, the president directs you to leave. And he looked up, and over his glasses and fixed me, and he said, all in good time, young major, and everybody knew what that meant. He just froze me. But at that time, Martin looked up at Wolf Lehman and he said, Wolf, I guess it's time to go.
At that point, Major Jim Keene, who's running the Marine Security Guards, approaches Colonel Madison and tells Colonel Madison, sir, it's over. Only Americans from now on. And Colonel Madison says, the hell, I've got a commitment. We need 6 more birds to get these people out, and we've been promised them. And Major Keene, as I recall it, says something to the effect of, "Sir, not going to happen. It's a presidential order."
Madison said, "I'm going to speak to the ambassador." And I, as we watched the 46 lift off the roof of the ambassador, and I said, "There he goes." I said, "This is no nonsense, Colonel. It's time. There are no more helicopters."
And it dawns on Colonel Madison, Summers, and myself that we've been had. Maybe not by malice, but by circumstances.
When we found out that we'd been lied to and that the evacuation helicopters were not coming, and we're told to surreptitiously make our way from the landing zone into the embassy and to abandon these last loads, it was absolute feeling of shame, a feeling of disgust toward the United States and the whole operation.
I was sitting on the hood of a black sedan with its headlights pointing out into the landing zone, and I sat there with a radio, pretending to talk to helicopters that I knew weren't out there, and saying to those people, "Don't worry. Large tuk tang malun, big helicopter, saptai, about to come."
There was no question that this pile of people in the parking lot were going to get left.
It crossed my mind that maybe I should stay. And then I thought, you'll never get these people out. The Marine Guards are leaving. And with that, I excused myself to the Vietnamese, said, "Matnaidi, I have to go to the bathroom." Went over to a little house that was in the embassy compound, through the bushes, spirited, got myself into the embassy and headed for the roof.
Around 5:30 in the morning of April the 30th, the last helicopter touched down.
We got on that helicopter, and the helicopter lifted off the roof. I looked down in the parking lot, and of course there were the people lined up in their groups of 50. And they were, of course, I knew, the last victims, the victims of the final betrayal of the war. And the helicopter banked and headed out of Saigon, and we went to the Okinawa.
On the morning of April the 30th, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. And within hours, South Vietnam's President Minh had surrendered.
I received announcement of surrender as a disgrace, and we felt ashamed about that.
As North Vietnamese troops took over Saigon, Nguyen Ngoc Nhan went about destroying evidence of his past in the South Vietnamese army.
We put the gun down to the well, on the uniforms, on the albums from the academy and from the military services. I put everything in the well and we covered it. And we started the new life from then on.
Out at sea, America's 7th Fleet was swarming with refugees. As space on the decks became scarce, millions of dollars in equipment was simply thrown overboard. Helicopters were ditched at sea.
And I remember thinking, what an utter, total, useless waste the whole thing turned out to. All of this. I mean, I wasn't thinking about the politics of it or the right and wrong of the policy, but just all those years, all that blood, all that fear, all of it had turned out just to be for nothing, absolutely for nothing.
Official Washington had very little of note to say about the events in Indochina. Senate Democratic leader Mansfield told reporters, "The fewer postmortems, the better. It's time to start afresh."
I fully expected when we returned, not just I, but all of us in positions of responsibility returned to Washington, we would be formally debriefed. What were the last days like? What lessons can we learn? This, and this? Nothing. Nothing.
Nobody wanted to learn the lessons of the fall. It was too humiliating. When I came back to CIA headquarters in the aftermath, the attitude was, forget. Go on to the next assignment.
Lionel Rosenblatt and Craig Johnstone were called in for a meeting at the State Department.
When Lionel and I made it back to Washington, we were summoned into Kissinger's office, and we were told beforehand that our lives were in his hands. I mean, it was one of these things where we had already figured long before that we had a better than a 50-50 chance of being fired.
So I heard one day that 2 of the Foreign Service officers had just taken off and gone to Vietnam to save people they knew and people that had worked with us. which is a total violation of every State Department rule.
And we walked in, and he said in that typical Kissinger voice, "Is it true what I read about you guys?" And we said, "Substantially, yes."
And I mumbled some disapproval of what they had done. And then I said to them, "I'm extremely proud of you. And you did exactly what we as a country should be doing."
And you two guys have been some of the few who've done the right thing, and we're very proud of you and want to congratulate you. And we were astonished, of course.
We spent a lot of time then talking about the issue of Vietnam as a whole. Was there any way to have handled it differently? Once we were in it, could we have extracted ourselves in a smoother way than the way that we did?
In a very real sense, that last drama, that last scene of the last tragic act in the courtyard of the embassy was a microcosm for the war as a whole. Because at the beginning we told the Vietnamese around 1964 to stand up and fight, we're with you. And when we told the Vietnamese that, in our idealism and our naivete and our sense of being omnipotent, we meant it. And in the end, of course, we made that commitment in good faith, but we were unable to carry it out, and we wound up betraying the country. And that's just what happened in a smaller sense in that last hour in the embassy courtyard in Saigon on the 30th of April, 1975.
In the end, America left behind tens of thousands of people who'd relied on the United States to protect them. Most ended up in what the North Vietnamese called re-education camps, Nguyen Ngoc Nan among them. After his release in 1978, Nan and his wife and their 4-year-old son fled Vietnam by boat. Their boat sank off the coast of Malaysia. Nan managed to get ashore. His wife and his son died.